Our next speaker is Dr. Terrence Moore. Dr. Moore has written frequently on the issue of liberal education, limited government, and traditional manhood, publishing articles and editorials with the Claremont Review of Books, the Washington Times, HumanEvents.com, Big Government, Touchstone, The Family in America, and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Moore has been one of the foremost critics of the Common Core, testifying before legislative bodies in 4 different states, posting a series of articles in townhall.com, speaking frequently on the topic throughout the nation and on talk radio, and writing a book, The Story Killers, which is actually on a table over here. If you'd like to pick up Dr. Moore's book, it is here available for you to purchase tonight. But it's called Story Killers, A Common Sense Case Against the Common Core. Tonight, the Common Core is killing off the great stories of a great people. Consequently, both in the minds and hearts of our children are in peril. Please help me welcome Dr. Terrence Moore.
Well, good evening. How are y'all doing? All right, good. I'd like to thank Mrs. Mary Cass for having me in here, and I've gotten to know her over the last few months, and also all y'all for coming out and figuring out what's going to happen in your children's classrooms, and also Dr. Stotsky for setting things up perfectly, because we're going to have a little standards test here in a minute. But let me say one thing. I'm now at Hillsdale College, and I help set up classical schools around the country. Before doing that, I ran a classical school in Colorado. And let me just say that we know what good education is. We know what math is. We know what English is. Mathematics has not changed in the last 50 years, nor has the English language changed in the last 50 years, nor has the human condition changed in the last 50 years. So to think that we have to give our children over to these newfangled standards because of this scary thing called the 21st century global economy is to buy the biggest progressive educational lie, hook, line, and sinker. Let's take an example of one of these standards, because that's what we hear, as Dr. Stotsky pointed out. These standards are so rigorous, and it's going to cause our students to just be college and career ready and all the rest of it. So this is from the English standards. This is standard RL-2.9, which means Reading Standards for Literature, 2nd grade, Standard 9, and it reads as follows. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Whoa! Impressive. Highfalutin. Let's now translate. This is written obviously in educational gobbledygook, so let's translate this. By the end of the year, by the end of the 2nd grade year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry. Wow, literature has stories and poetry in it. I didn't know that. In the grades 2 through 3 complexity band, that is 2nd and 3rd grade being combined for whatever reason, with scaffolding is needed at the high end of the range. If you've not heard scaffolding, this is the educational buzzword at the moment. It's taken from the metaphor of a building. So you build up a building with scaffolding is what the builders use. Once the building is built, the scaffolding goes away, right? In the old days, we called scaffolding teaching. Or you could even call it help. So let me now translate for you what this standard is. Remember, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding is needed at the high end of the range. Or, students in 2nd grade should read and understand more difficult books at the end of the year than at the beginning. They may need help, though. The depressing thing is, though, when you go to the actual standards and see the books that they're recommending in what's called Appendix B, where they say, here are the books that you should be reading in the 2 through 3 complexity band, you find that all these books are of recent origin. They were written in the 90s or in the 2000s. They're not rigorous, and in fact, some of the books, one called Tops and Bottoms, if you look on the Amazon page, you find out that it's for ages 4 to 8. That's hardly rigorous, and the publisher himself says that, and the author. And then, and some of these other things are just monosyllabic gibberish that maybe I would read to my 2 or 3-year-old, but I certainly wouldn't have a second or third grader reading it. What you don't find in the second and third grade are any classic fairy tales being recommended, or any fables. There is no Hans Christian Andersen in the entire core. There are no tall tales, so no Paul Bunyan, nothing like that. In short, nothing that would actually interest a child in literature and get him or her reading. So what's going on here at the early elementary level is they're basically giving the students schlock that's not going to engage them in reading. And then by the time you get into the upper grades, that's when the real mischief is taking place, as we'll talk about in a minute. But I think what I think you have to understand about the English standards is that they are robbing us of great literature. They're taking out the great stories in the name of this futuristic society. And you ask yourself, well, why would they do that? Well, what do stories do other than teach us about the human condition? To teach us how to understand people, to see characters engaged in difficult situations from which we derive lessons in beauty, in virtue, in love. These are the things that the great stories have always told us. Now, do we really live in a world in which love doesn't mean anything anymore, or in which virtue doesn't mean anything? Well, that's what's being ripped out of the curriculum. So let me give you a few examples here of what you find when you look deeply into the Common Core, and this is something I do at length on some articles and in my book. But the first thing you notice when you look at Appendix B, which has all these recommended readings, is that there is no literature whatsoever inspired by religion. None. So no Augustine's Confessions, though the Common Core claims to like autobiography. No Milton's Paradise Lost, though it's the greatest English epic. No sermons of any kind, such as Jonathan Edwards. And something even more interesting, and this is, if you look into the actual textbooks, which we'll do in a moment, you'll find that no kind of rhetoric that's inspired by religion ever makes its way into a Common Core textbook. For example, Sojourner Truth, whom they have in a certain American Experience textbook by Prentice Hall. But they don't actually quote Sojourner Truth giving a speech or a sermon of any kind. Why not? Well, because if you know anything about Sojourner Truth, you know that she was always referring to God. And if you read her speeches, they're infused with God. That's where she derives her ideas from equality from. And she's very explicit about that. That's why her name is Sojourner Truth. And there's a very famous moment in which, in the antebellum period, when Frederick Douglass is giving this really talk, when he ends up, he's just really depressing, and he ends on a depressing note. Sojourner Truth stands up and says, "Frederick, is God dead?" Why isn't that in there? You will not find her actual words in there, and I think it's because they don't want any religion in. What else do you find in the Common Core textbooks, or not find? You don't find any Benjamin Franklin. No Benjamin Franklin whatsoever is recommended. Why? I think it's because he's the great American who shows us the American way of life, self-help. He didn't need a government grant to discover the principles of electricity. So you can't have Franklin's autobiography in the standards, period. What else do you find when you look in the standards? And again, I'm referring to Appendix B. A lot of people have been tricked by this, but if you look in the Appendix B, you'll say, well, here they're referring to the Constitution, but they never had the students read the entire Constitution. What they'll do instead is have them reading a segment, such as at the middle school, in the middle school grades, they say, read the preamble to the Constitution and the First Amendment. That's it. Of course, not the Second Amendment, not the 10th Amendment. And then what they do, just a couple of inches down, is they include a text under the guise of one of these informational texts, which is written by a modern scholar or commentator on the Constitution, whose name is Linda Monk. And what she does is say, the first 3 words of the Constitution, and I am quoting, are the most important. They clearly state that the people, not the king, not the legislature, not the courts, are the true rulers of American government. Okay, fine, so far so good. She goes on, but who are we the people? This question troubled the nation for centuries, as Lucy Stone, one of America's first advocates for women's rights, asked in 1853, "We the people? Which we the people?" The women were not included. Neither were white males who did not own property, American Indians or African Americans, so on and so forth. Then Monk quotes Thurgood Marshall, who says, "For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution," that's a code word, "we need to look no further than the first three words of the document." And he goes on to say how the Founding Fathers never had in mind, as far as we the people, black males or women at all. There's only one problem with that. If he's talking about the franchise, Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution clearly turns the franchise over to the states. And guess what? During the adoption of the Constitution, there were actually black males and women voting, for example, in New Jersey. So, and we could get into a lot of history, in fact, of all the marks against slavery that the founders put in the Constitution and in different things that were going on, but that's not the discussion that they want at the 8th grade level. They want the 8th graders to read "We the People," and then after you've barely taken a breath, they want to discredit the Constitution. Game over. They're producing attitudes that are not in line with what history actually tells us. It gets worse. For example, you'll see a speech of Ronald Reagan listed in the standards, and you think, well, gee whiz, this couldn't be biased in any way, except the speech that they offer is not in the first inaugural. It's not the speech at the Brandenburg Gate. You remember, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's this obscure speech given at Moscow State University. So why? Well, you don't understand that until you look at an actual textbook and you see that they have, in the unit called the Cold War, an editorial from the New York Times in 1999 that says, well, we all knew that the Berlin Wall was bound to fall eventually, but that it came down as bloodlessly as it did 10 years ago this week is largely a tribute to one leader. Today, Mikhail Gorbachev is a political pariah in Russia and increasingly forgotten in the West, but history will remember him generously for his crucial role in ending the Cold War, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, what happens to the Reagan speech? Well, about 20 pages later, not in connection with the Cold War, we're given this introduction to that obscure Reagan speech. Led by Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviets were blazing through the greatest changes they had seen since the 1917 revolution. Although reforms were rapidly taking root, they were not far enough from communist ideology for Reagan. In this excerpt, notice how Reagan restrains his strongly anti-communist sentiments while still extolling the ideals he represents. Now that's how y'all remember Reagan, right? Restraining his strongly anti-communist sentiments. No? Well, that's the story that the students are being given. And understand that the students who are in, let's say, middle school right now, they were born in the year 2000. They don't know Reagan from Adam. And this is history clearly being rewritten in our schools. Here's another example. And I'll just tell you what my thesis is. You probably divined it by now. But these standards are either entirely superficial and silly, that is, the curriculum that goes with them, or they're politically biased. And you know which direction the political bias is moving. So, for example, again, this is a literature class. Supposedly in a textbook, they have 20 pages devoted to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. No page has Mary Shelley's Frankenstein on it. Instead, they have a bunch of gimmicks to include a picture of Frankenstein's monster from a movie. And then on top of that, for 5.5 pages, they have a skit live from New York. It's Saturday night, in which they have characters acting out a spoof on Frankenstein. I'm going to read the dialogue. So Frankenstein's monster shows up to this village. Villager number 1. Well, maybe you're the monster. Head villager shakes his head. I'm not the monster. Look at him. He's got a square head and green skin. Frankenstein's monster. Oh, great. Now it's a racial thing. You know what? You guys are a bunch of fascists. In the margin of the teacher's edition, this is what the teachers are told to say. Point out the use of the term fascist. Explain its traditional political meaning and how it has been extended to any right-wing extremist group. Whoa! This is in an English class? Look, here is the two scary things that I'll leave you with. Number one, this is only This is only the English standards. The reason why English and math were adopted first is because they were supposed to be non-controversial. There are a whole bunch of social studies standards waiting out there to be adopted. And I've looked at those, and they're worse. So for example, in geography, if you look at the geography standards, you will not find the word continent, or the word country, or the word city, or the word state. Isn't that what you think geography is? What do you think the most popular word is in the social studies standards? Environment. And you can work through the standards and you can see how it is written into the standards how man-made catastrophes lead to all sorts of disaster in the environment. Plain as the nose on your face. And then on top of that, they have as the question that is supposed to define how these standards get into practice, in which they take an historical event. Which event do you think they use? The American Revolution? The Civil War? World War II? What was the effect of the recent Great Recession on different groups of people? The recent Great Recession. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't know that we could talk about this in the past tense. But this is clearly political proselytizing. And then the final word that I'll conclude with, and this may be the scariest thing to know, on page 1 of the English standards, the comment is made that the standards are meant to be a living work. As new evidence emerges, the standards will be changed accordingly. So as bad as the standards are now, and whatever the legislatures think they're adopting, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they'll be totally unrecognizable, and the people will have no say whatsoever. Thank you. $17.55 and 56 seconds.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.